Good morning. Welcome to 4Media and to our Friday Q&A live stream as we prepare to enter yet another month of this odd new world. I was thinking it's strange what we've learnt in all this. Words and phrases we'd hardly heard of before, like furlough or social distancing, the R rate, flattening the curve, and PPE. They're all in common use now. And this week we've also discovered where Barnard Castle is and that it's a very good place to drive to if you think you might be going a bit blind. Anyway, here at 4Media, we've not been travelling very much, but it has been a hell of a busy week for us, holding remote broadcast days, launching surveys, and gaining some great print and online coverage. Mostly we're working from our living rooms, or mainly the garden in my case, even to the extent of producing videos and podcasts. As you probably know, from the start of lockdown, we've held one of these live streams every week, each time with a leading light from a section of the UK media. A big thank you to all those experts who've given us their time, but also to the hundreds of you who've supported us. And if you need our help or advice with anything at all, then please do get in touch with one of the 4Media team. For those of you who don't know me, under this white thatch that hasn't seen a barber in 3 months, I'm Alan Edwards, the head of news at 4Media. I'm the former night editor of the Sun newspaper, with many years in Fleet Street under my belt. Between me and my team and Sam Dibley and his broadcast team, we have pretty comprehensive insights into the media, and we're here to help if we can. Today, I am very excited to have as our guest one of Britain's leading journalists with an extraordinary reputation for breaking major stories. For years, he was one of the country's top show business journalists, as showbiz editor first of all of the News of the World and then The Sun, winning countless national awards. He was also known to millions as Lorraine's showbiz correspondent on the telly. In the past couple of years, Dan Wootton has made an almost unprecedented move into more serious stuff. As well as being the executive editor of The Sun and helping frame its editorial direction, he has taken on the plum role of drivetime host on TalkRadio. On top of that, he writes an opinion column in The Sun, which, especially during the coronavirus crisis, has captured the mood of the nation and earned universal plaudits. Somehow, he finds time to continually break fantastic stories. And the scoop of the year, that's Harry and Meghan stepping down from royal life and quitting Britain, well, that was his too. I think you all know the drill. Many people have sent in questions in advance, which I'll put to Dan on your behalf. There's also a facility for you to tap in questions as we go, which will appear down the side of the screen. I'll do my best to get to as many as I can in the next 30 minutes. So I understand that there's one or two technical difficulties with the internet across the country. So while we resolve those, and I resolve mine, I'm going to hand you over to our producer Sam to introduce and talk to Dan Wootton.
I'm going to go ahead and take over for him at the moment while he tries to figure out what issues he's having at the moment. So a couple of questions that have been coming through at the moment, and I'll start from the top here. First of all, do you think that there's fatigue on COVID-related content, sort of PR-wise or otherwise?
Well, I actually don't yet, to be honest. I mean, clearly this is a story that all media organizations are having to balance up. And how do you go back to any sort of story that isn't related to COVID? And the reality is that in virtually 90% of cases at the moment, it is related to coronavirus, because how can it not be?
Fantastic. And what does it take really to get onto TalkRadio at the moment, you know, from sort of people wanting to get on there and get their sort of message out there?
Yeah, well, definitely any form of interesting angle. So, I'll give you an example. We had the chief executive of KFC on when he was announcing that the restaurants were going to start reopening up, because obviously, while there is I guess a very sad business story behind that, it also felt like a reason to celebrate, So there are definitely opportunities, I guess, especially if there's good news at the moment. So obviously we're hearing so much bad news about certain businesses and our way of life, but I guess anything positive, and hopefully over the next few weeks, we're going to see lots of reopenings and that sort of thing.
Mm. And so in that case, what would you say to PRs and brands who don't necessarily approach because they're afraid of what Julia Hartley-Brewer will say, for example?
Well, I would say number one, you should always approach. I mean, Julia is a pussycat, really. But I guess definitely all of the shows, I mean, especially if you look across the week at Talk Radio, there are definitely shows that are designed for different things. So clearly my show and Julia's show are much more centered on the news of the day. But there are lots and lots of feature opportunities throughout the schedule during the week as well. Mark Dolan and Kevin O'Sullivan host some brilliant weekend shows, which are much more feature orientated. If it's an issue specifically related to women, we have a great 3-hour Saturday night show called Badass Women's Hour, which is very PR friendly in terms of getting different brands or events onto the station. So I guess what I would always say is approach. And if it's not something that's right for my show or for Julia's show, if you ask to be pointed in the direction of a producer for another show, that's usually a really good way around it.
Okay. And I've got a question that's just come through here. People are asking, do you think that people out there trust broadcast more than the press at this moment in time?
Well, obviously, that's a really difficult question for me because I straddle both. I would say, to be honest, this hasn't been a great crisis for the media in quite a lot of ways, being totally honest. I would also say, and clearly I'm going to say this, but I think at The Sun and at Talk Radio, we have been very conscious of the public mood. So I guess the example that is most fresh of mind would be last night during the daily briefing. Obviously, there was a huge announcement from the Prime Minister about a whole load of lockdown lifting measures, about the fact that we'd met the 5 tests, but also some really bad news for the people who are still shielding and are going to have to stay in their houses for many weeks to come. And we had an overwhelming reaction from listeners who said that when the BBC and ITV asked again about Dominic Cummings, they were actually really angry and upset, because what you've got to realize, the veil has been lifted on journalism a little bit through this whole process, because the daily briefings have become this almost must-watch event for millions of people across the country. And I thought that was a very strange moment.
Of course. I guess it all boils down to sort of facts and what facts people actually have available to them. So do you, personally, do you like stories that are backed up by research and that has that presented to you alongside it?
Definitely, absolutely. I mean, especially at the moment, research, if you have epidemiologists connected to it, if you have scientists connected to it, if you have a credible poll or a credible survey connected to it, that really helps at the moment, because obviously things need to be anchored in fact, which sounds really obvious, but actually it's sort of particularly important at the moment, given there is so much conjecture around.
Certainly, and there's also a big emphasis, I think, on general fact checking is happening nowadays as well. So what more can PRs do to attract your attention to a story other than, for example, research and facts?
Well, the advice that I always give is that it's never a good idea to try and personalize something that is all round. And I actually saw another journalist tweet about this the other day, and I really agree, because he said there's nothing worse than getting an email from a PR, which you know is an all-round email, but they're trying to make it look as if they've sent it just to you, and then they follow up with another question about it. So for me, the advice that I've always given to PRs is just email a couple of sentences directly to the journalist. Make it clear that they are only contacting you if there's something that you want to directly pitch. Obviously, it's very different if you're just sending a press release out into the world and you want to see who responds. That's a completely different thing. But if you're making a personal pitch, actually do make it personal. Make it 1 or 2 sentences, or ask if you can have a phone conversation with that person, because I think journalists now, because we get so much coming through our inbox, and I always will try and reply to something, but if you can quite obviously tell that this is something that has gone to everyone else, then you're far less likely to reply.
Excellent. Well, funny enough, that answers a lot of the next question that we had, which was to do with the best way to ensure that stories have a chance of making it with you. So would you say that email or phone is the best way of getting hold of you? Is there a preference that you have about how people would contact, or most successful ways they could get you to pick up their work?
Well, for me, I would always say email, and I reckon most journalists would agree with that now, and especially given that we are, not in offices now. I don't know. Maybe other journalists feel different, but I personally feel like a cold call to my mobile phone always feels a little bit invasive, and I'm someone that is across my emails. So I guess sometimes for PR, it's quite hard to know if a journalist has actually received an email, and I do understand that. And there are some journalists, I'm not going to name them, but some journalists at my place who have shown me their inbox, and it's like 220,000 emails in there. And I'm actually not like that. So I'm totally across my email. I will read everything. But obviously, if it's something that isn't for me, and it's something that's all round, or I can tell it's something that isn't personal to me, then it is possible I will delete it. But I definitely will look at it and acknowledge it. And if I am interested, get back.
Awesome. So in terms of content then of the stories themselves, we've got a question through here from Hannah. What would you say is best to absolutely steer clear of in terms of stories to pitch? And are there any specific areas, brands, PRs that shouldn't shout about it at this time? And then on the flip side of that, I guess, what kind of stories are you always kind of a yes sort of answer to for you?
Well, I know it is very difficult at the moment, but I hope things are starting to change. I can completely understand that in the early days of this pandemic, it must have been particularly difficult for PRs to consider when to pitch a story, and if it was inappropriate, or if there was going to be a backlash for doing something. What my advice would be is don't unnecessarily piggyback onto coronavirus if what you're promoting actually has nothing to do with it. I think sometimes that's when there's criticism about something being crass. But actually, remember, there are lots and lots of other pages in the newspaper to fill every day. There is lots of content, and hopefully increasingly more content that isn't actually directly connected to coronavirus. And I also think it's going to be very important, and the media is going to have a responsibility too. We need advertisers back, we need business back. And I really hope businesses don't feel scared about screaming and shouting about what they're doing at the moment, because it's absolutely essential that as a media, we support business getting back on its feet, because it has to happen. And so I include that in the entertainment industry too, or definitely with food and retail. It's absolutely essential that you guys are able to shout about your clients. But I guess where there's that little warning sign is if it's anything that looks crass.
Certainly. So almost showing that the world is still spinning, but without making a profit, as it were, off the situation. Fantastic.
Yeah, completely.
Well, we've had a lot of questions flying through thick and fast, just trying to keep up with them here. But I think the next thing I'll pick up is, obviously you're a man of many talents, as we can see you obviously present on the TalkRadio. You also work with The Sun, so you're across many forms of media. A question that's come through, I guess, that kind of splits those two. First of all, is what differences are you looking for in a story in terms of from print to online to broadcast?
It's a good question, but actually my answer is probably slightly predictable. And it's that I just think a good story is a good story. And especially when it comes to The Sun now, we are breaking down the divisions between online and print. So there's actually not going to be a difference. I mean, clearly there are some stories that might fly online for a particular reason, but to me, there isn't a difference apart from in timing. And obviously, my advice always is if you want something to hit big in a newspaper, try and give it exclusively. That's the first thing, or try and release it much later in the day so that it doesn't feel like old news. But if you are looking for online pickup, and of course the Sun Online has a huge growing audience now, then you can come to us 24/7 now.
Excellent. Well, I mean, that's good to hear. The 24/7 contact reachable. But in terms of from the radio point of view, then, have there been any stories that have come through recently that sort of you've really enjoyed, or that you've really sort of enjoyed sharing with your listeners, or that you've had good positive feedback on from them?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, some of them have come via PR sources. So, for example, the O2 telephone network and venue, you know, the big venue that it sponsors in London, when the Nightingale Hospital was being constructed in London, of course, at the end of the day, we know that it wasn't needed, but to begin with, it looked like this was going to be a very, very crucial part of the fight against coronavirus. O2 was doing some brilliant work in terms of transferring that facility, the entertainment facility, you know, the O2 where we go and watch concerts and shop, was transforming that into a training facility for nurses to go and work at the Nightingale Hospital. And they PR'd that. And I actually just thought, what an amazing thing, you know, and how brilliant that a big company like O2 is actually throwing everything into the national effort, presumably with no financial gain. So, you know, they were making sure that all of the technology was right at the actual Nightingale. Then they were using the O2 as a training facility. And so I got someone on from O2 to talk about that. And I think it was a really good example, actually, of businesses showing that they're doing very positive things. And we've had other examples of that, you know, other types of companies that have transformed their business in order to start making PPE, for example, too.
Excellent. And you know, very interesting to hear there about a spokesperson. Feeds nicely into a question that we've just got through here from Chris, which is, do you feel that a celeb is necessary, or if a brand or someone can't get a celeb endorsement from someone or a representative, is there something else that they could try instead that would still work?
Yeah, absolutely. And surprisingly, I would say for me, there's a big difference between the Sun and TalkRadio. For the Sun, a celebrity angle is always more likely to get in. And for example, yesterday, there's a big campaign connected to raising money for coronavirus. And Arlene Phillips, the ex-Strictly Come Dancing judge, was on my show, and that worked great. But what I would say is that actually you can always put up a chief executive. And that would be my advice, because I would say the big boss is much better than, for example, I don't know, a chief marketing officer or someone like that. But obviously, sometimes if there is a specialist person at an organization who's actually directly working on a project, that can be really helpful too. But I would always feel confident, especially if they're media trained and they're confident, and most chief executives are. A chief executive is a really good person to put up, because definitely in terms of the radio, you know, if you feel like you're speaking to the boss of an organization, then you can really get answers. And Heathrow Airport has been very, very sensible in the way that they have put out their chief executive over the past few weeks. You know, Heathrow's right at the center of this whole thing. He came on my show. I actually agree with his points, but he made some really, really strong arguments. And I've also seen him appear across the media. And I think it's because it was the chief executive that Heathrow was putting up that meant that he got all of those bookings.
Fantastic. Good to know. So I've got a question that's popped through here about, I guess, content as a whole, in terms of, I guess, online and everything like that. How valuable is video content to you when it comes to a story?
It is increasingly valuable, actually, but I guess it depends what type of video content it is, and depends if it's exclusive or not, and depends if we have the copyright to use it, for example, across social media, because there are times when companies maybe will allow you to run something on the website, but not on social media. But yes, it is valuable actually. And I think PRs could be using video more to get messages out, because there's nothing better, is there, than fun, funny, creative, or shocking or interesting video. So to me, it feels like, and I don't know what you're doing with it, but video feels like still quite an untapped area of PR. Because obviously, and I mean, it's a sad reality and it's not necessarily something I agree with, but because of the way that online journalism has gone now, there's not always the opportunity to create content in the same way that there used to be. So sometimes if you're putting out pre-made packaged video content in whatever form, you are going to get a lot of pickup from it.
Fantastic. Well, I can see here that Alan has fixed his technical difficulties, so I'm going to bow out and allow him to take over and finish off the rest of the questions for you.
Hi, Dan.
Alan, I was so sad you were giving me such a lovely introduction, and then I thought it was me. I thought I'd disappeared, but it was you.
Actually, I'm not sure where I am now. Yeah, sorry, my internet has just completely failed. So I'm now working on 4G. So anything could happen, really. So oh, we'll see what's happening.
I can see you and hear you loud and clear.
Good. So I mean, I'm just going to dip in now, and if you've been asked these questions before, then I will move on. So I'm just thinking, influencers are so important nowadays. How do they make the transition to radio or papers for that matter, or do they not at all?
I think it's actually really hard for influencers, Al, because I don't think simply being a social media influencer means that you do make that transition to mainstream media. Now, look, maybe that changes over the years to come. But I think about, I mean, I'm 37, and I think about the influencers that I can name, and all of them are people who have appeared on a mainstream television show. So they've sort of used their base as an influencer to get that big booking on, Strictly Come Dancing or I'm a Celebrity or whatever, and then they cross over. Simply being an influencer, I don't think at the moment necessarily gives you traction in the mainstream media, because there's such a generational divide, isn't there? I mean, I guess it depends what market you're aiming at. If you're aiming for a very young audience, then clearly it would cross over more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we're finding as well, that influencers play a part, but they don't always make that transition, with one or two obvious exceptions. So just moving on a little bit from one of the questions we've had, and yet again, stop me if you've had this before. In the current climate, how can we ensure that our stories have the best chance of making it onto Talk Radio or into the Sun? And how can we best work with you, as people are saying they're increasingly struggling in these days to get hold of journalists?
Yeah, well, because journalists are not in the office, and I do think there is an element of that, but I would still say the best way to do it is on email. I would also say really think about timing, because I think the worst thing for me as a journalist is not being given any time to think about anything. So, here's this press release, it's just come out, it's gone all round. Well, actually, what if I wanted to do it exclusively in the Sun? Or what if I wanted to have the guest exclusively on Talk Radio? Actually, you need a bit of lead time for that, at least 24 hours lead time. I mean, I'm not saying days and days or anything like that, but I would say sometimes just give a bit of a window to allow journalists to actually respond. Because if it's a state of complete that this press release is going out at 9 a.m., then, and you're just being told about it at 8 a.m., then sometimes there's not any opportunity to work with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just had one come in just as we've been talking. How do you feel about love or dating app related stories? I think we find that there's a lot of those out there trying to get some traction.
I actually think there's real interest in it. I really do. I think I think so much about our day-to-day life has changed as a result of coronavirus. And certainly in terms of the sun, we're not afraid of that. You know, I was editing over the weekend and we ran a story about a survey of how Britain's sex lives have changed as a result of lockdown. And, you know, these are genuine questions. There's genuine interest about it. And clearly, especially for single people, lockdown has been particularly tough. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in those types of stories. But again, it's sort of what I was saying before. Sometimes you've got to find a way to pitch them without it looking like this is a crass way of piggybacking on what is like a pandemic killing lots of people. So actually, maybe just tell the story straight. You don't always need to feel as if you're connecting it directly to what we're going through, because that connection is obvious anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got one here that refers to the Sun specifically. Which charitable causes is the Sun most likely to support? And is there an opportunity to get the Sun interested in supporting certain charitable causes?
There is. I mean, we have backed the big NHS charity, you know, the same charity that Captain Tom Moore has been raising money for. And we thought a lot about that. But at the end of the day, that is an incredible umbrella charity that is providing lots of support to different aspects of the NHS. We're also, because it's our 50th year, giving away £1 million to smaller charities that approach us. So there are two big causes. We're particularly focused now as well on our Who Cares Wins Awards, which is going to be later this year. Now, this is an awards that we've run for a few years now, but it couldn't be more important this year because it's the NHS. It's for the NHS. So I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that we are looking to partner with people on that for sure. And if there are people interested in getting involved in that, because this is going to be this year just an incredible celebration, because think of how important the NHS has become to our national conversation and how many heroes there's been. And as I say, this is always something, and you know this, Al, from your time at the Sun, we've always been passionate about this, but I guess maybe the country will have caught up to us somewhat this year. And I think it's going to be a really big event, and it's hosted by my good friend Lorraine Kelly, as you know.
Absolutely, and fantastic she is at doing that sort of thing, because she really cares. Moving on a little bit, I'm not sure if you've had this either, but exclusives, how important are they to you, with both your hats on, and at a time when brands are working to promote important messages? Do you think it's still important to ask for exclusivity?
They're important, but they're not everything. I mean, obviously, my whole career was made on breaking exclusives, but definitely when it comes to talk radio, we're more interested in how we cover a story than it necessarily being exclusive, because obviously we have a unique take, we're a unique station, we have a unique audience. And so it's not always necessary to be exclusive, but the one rule that we do have is that we'll never double up on shows across the day. So of course, even though I absolutely adore my colleagues, I would be saying, well, come on Drive Time, because this is an amazing show and you get the coverage on my social media channels and you get the connection with the Sun. So I guess my pitch is to reveal big news during Drive Time, because it's the big newsy time of the day. But in terms of the Sun, obviously we are going to prioritize exclusive stories, and it still does remain important, but it doesn't mean that we won't cover your story if it's really good. But I guess there is always going to be a focus on exclusives at the Sun, always.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking you back a bit towards talk radio, and I love this question that's come in. Has lockdown been a renaissance moment for radio, do you think?
I really think it has. I mean, look, we haven't got the RAJAR figures in for lockdown, but we did get the last ones in, and I was able to grow my show 22% year on year. And for me, that was huge because obviously hosting last year was Eamon Holmes, who is a broadcasting legend. And I actually don't put that down to me at all. I put that down to the fact that the world and this country was going through this absolute time of turmoil. And so people want live information and they want a sense of community. And our real focus on Talk Radio, and this is where we have stood apart from the rest of the media, especially this week, is we are covering this whole crisis without hysteria and without scaremongering. And I'm not criticizing other journalists or shows because I think everyone has to do it in their own way. But the tone that our listeners are really appreciating, because I hear from so many of them, is the fact that we're not immediately looking to pull people down, and we're trying to deal with things with a level head. But I just believe overall, Al, even taking it away from my station, like the lockdown has been bad for podcasts. It's been bad for Spotify and streaming services. And don't get me wrong, I love podcasts and I love streaming music. But right now, it feels like you want to be tuned in to live, and you want to be tuned into community, and you want to be tuned into news. And I feel very excited about what this has done for radio. And I don't know about you, but my live radio listening has exploded over the past 3 months because I want to know what's going on, and I want to know what people think about it, and I want to know what's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about your program specifically, I mean, of course, you every day you get the big government announcement, the big press conference. So that obviously takes up lots of your show. But what opportunities are there for other content?
Yeah, but that takes up the middle. So that does take up the middle hour of my show. But I'm on here from 4 p.m. till 7 p.m. Monday to Thursday. So, I mean, there's so much time. I tend to have a lighter final half hour. So that's a great place for like celebrities that you've got to place, or for some lighter stories. But obviously in terms of news and polling, we will do that throughout the day. But it obviously does depend on events at the moment, because the Dominic Cummings story this week has sparked such a huge interest in our listeners, and a huge anger actually, that we have been clearing so much of the show, because we will always base what we're doing on what is engaging the listeners. But overall, there are definitely good spots, because, you know, the great thing about radio is there's a lot of time. You know, there is a lot of time. We can go more in depth, and we can give people a fair crack of the whip in terms of interview time as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned celebrities there. So this is a bit of an unfair question, really, and think of budgets when you answer this. But give me a couple of examples of your dream celeb to have on there, bearing in mind that we haven't got 100 grand to spend for most PR budgets.
Yeah, no, actually, and I will be totally honest, like for me, the celebrities that have been interesting over lockdown have been very different types of celebrity. So, for example, I think the people who are doing really well are some of those political celebrities, you know. So if you look at an Ed Balls and Edwina Curry, do you know the sort of people I mean? Because they are
Absolutely
celebrity people, but they also have an idea about government and an idea about what politicians might be going through, you know. And actually, you've seen the explosion in terms of profile of people like George Osborne as well, because I think there is a real desire for expertise. And also, I mean, you know, who would have ever thought that professors and epidemiologists were turning into household names as well, you know? So Professor Carol Sikora, for example, who I've actually quoted at one of the government briefings in a question that I was giving to Boris Johnson, has, I would say, become a bit of a star, you know, because he's taken on this expert approach, and but also differed a lot of the time from what the government is doing. So actually, I think this is a time for experts. It's a time for people with knowledge. It's a time for sage thinking politicians. I mean, I've really enjoyed having people like David Blunkett on, because, you know, it's like they've been there, they've done that, they know how to deal with a crisis. And actually, you've seen people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as well. So I don't know. I also think celebrities that are older are really interesting at the moment too for the media. So Esther Ranson, Arlene Phillip, Harry Redknapp, because actually they're dealing with this. Alan Sugar's another one. They're having to deal with this in a different way. So look, I mean, it depends obviously what your project is and what you're talking about. But I think what I've really noticed is there is a difference about what celebrities are getting a lot of pickup.
Yeah, you mentioned there about the anger about Dominic Cummings. As you know, at 4Media we do lots of surveys as well, and interestingly enough, it's 2/3, I think, of people that we surveyed have said that the actions over Cummings had actually damaged Boris's reputation, which I think is pretty high. How important is it to you to get those kind of statistics to feed in to when people are trying to get you interested in the story?
Yeah, really important. And especially this week, actually. I feel like, this week has been an amazing week to have stats and to have facts and to have polling data. People really want it this week. And it's interesting because, I mean, it depends obviously what media outlet you're going for, but my calls into my radio show, and there have never been more calls on any issue than what there has been over Dominic Cummings. I mean, genuinely, we are getting more calls on this than we were getting at the height of the Brexit issue. But my calls are 70% in favour of Dominic Cummings and the government and 30% against. But again, that shows you what type of outlet we are, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm aware that we're encroaching onto your valuable time, mainly because I missed the first half of this.
No, I'm fine. I've got as
well,
much time as you need, Al.
All right, I'll keep going then. So a couple of personal questions for you.
Yes.
What's been a career highlight for you so far? And a follow-up, as they do in all the government briefings. Which particular story have you broken that you're the most proud of? I bet I could guess the second one, but maybe not.
Well, yeah, no, maybe not, actually. Maybe not. Because often sometimes stories that seem really good come with a whole load of stress. My career highlight, just being very, very selfish and self-centered, actually came really recently because I have a podcast called The Dan Wootton Interview. And to be honest, it's a total passion project that I work on with just a couple of my key crew at The Sun, and we've poured lots of time into it in the past 3 years. I mean, the podcast market is very crowded now. It's really difficult to make noise and to get traction. But it just won during lockdown, actually, the British Press Award for Lifestyle Podcast of the Year, which was a new category. But I just could not believe it because we were up against Giles Corran, we were up against the Times Walk the Dog podcast, the Sun's football podcast. So I actually genuinely think it's been a highlight for me because it was real validation that we'd actually done something really good, even if the podcast hasn't been like a massive commercial success. And sometimes actually you've got to do something that you're passionate about and you're creating great content, if you know what I mean. And in terms of stories, do you know what? It's actually not Megxit, but the story that I am most happy about is and that is most memorable to me. And Al, you might remember it actually, because you were there. I just started back at The Sun, and The Guardian had run a story a couple of weeks before saying that it was, I think, an interview with John Cleese saying that Monty Python would never reunite. And I get the call, and I've got to sort of work on it for a few weeks and keep it secret, that Monty Python are going to reunite. And obviously we know now that they will never reunite again after the tragic death the other week. And so we splashed on it. But why I just loved it, because it's so Sun, is we also, on the front page, we ran an offer for a free can of Spam with this on the day of running the story. And I just thought that's just the Sun all over. And that's why I'm at the Sun, and that's what I want to do. And it obviously just became a massive sort of talking point. And so it's a weird one, but it's one I'm really proud of.
Yeah, I remember it well, actually, and I would have said that would be Megxit, but presumably that's one of the stories that came with a whole lot of pain as well.
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, It was a crazy few weeks, but obviously it's no secret that Harry and Meghan's relationship with the British press is very, very strained. And obviously, I felt this was a story that was completely legitimate, completely in the public interest. You know, actually, what could be more in the public interest if members of our royal family are going to stay in the family or not? But there was a huge backlash from it, a backlash that continues. But I was proud of it, don't get me wrong, because they confirmed the story within 24 hours and then it exploded into this national, news event. But to be honest, I feel like I've spoken so much about Harry and Meghan over the past few months that, I'm sick of them.
As I think many of the public are as well. But great story. Dan, look, I'm going to let you go now. It's nearly 11:15. I apologise so much for all the technical difficulties earlier, and to everybody else out there, I apologise as well. But it's been, the bits that I heard of it, Dan, have been absolutely fascinating. And it's lovely to see you again. I wish you well. And to everybody else, thank you very much for listening. You got to hear our wonderful producer, Sam Howson, there asking the questions. So well done, Sam, for keeping things going while my internet was playing up. I'm going to go off and make some rude phone calls to Virgin Media. And we'll be back next week, hopefully with no more problems and with some more great guests. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. And as ever, stay safe. Bye-bye.